Recently, the Texas Animal Health Commission confirmed a case of anthrax in a cow in Tom Green County in Texas. And this follows the case of 2 sable antelopes that were infected in Edwards County about a month prior. To get a handle on what anthrax is and its effects on animals and humans, joining me on the phone is Dr. Buddy Faries. Dr. Faries is a professor and extension veterinarian with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service and with the National Center for Foreign Animal and Zoonotic Disease Defense. Hey, Buddy, how are you doing today?
I'm just fine. Good morning to you, Robert.
Great. Let's go ahead and start with the situation in Texas. We got a cow that's confirmed with anthrax last week. However, this is not necessarily a totally unusual thing in Texas or other parts of North America. Can you elaborate on that? Is it something about the Midwest or even parts of Canada where we see a lot of anthrax?
Okay. Well, just to make that point, Robert, that this disease, anthrax of livestock, including wild livestock such as deer, is indigenous to the United States. And there are various states that have more reported cases than others. And this always is considered to go back to the cattle drives that we had in the 1940s and 1950s, and following that trail drive from South Texas area to the Gulf Coast area, moving northward, there was a deaths of anthrax along the way, and that pretty well distributed the bacteria going from the southern part of the United States on to the northern part of the United States. So there are periodic cases of anthrax in livestock and wild livestock, not only in Texas, but New Mexico, Louisiana, Mississippi, and then you go on further north into Nebraska, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and go out west to some states, even including California. So the bacteria is in the soil, scattered in various areas of the United States, primarily just laying dormant as spores, resistant stages of bacteria, where the vegetative form of the bacteria has created a wall around itself and formed a spore stage, and can be resistant to the external environment for decades. So periodically there's a minor outbreak of a few cases periodically in various states, and Texas is one of the most common states where we do have periodic breaks of anthrax in livestock, primarily the cattle, sheep, and goats, and then also in the deer. And that does occur nearly every year or every few years. And knowing that it's in the soil and dormant for just decades, there are certain environmental conditions that will create a greater risk of exposure to our domestic livestock and to the native wild deer. And those environmental conditions are always associated with a drought. And we've been in a drought in Texas since 1994 with some periodic rains. And when it gets so dry in the soil where those spores are located, they surface in the dust and just surface to the top of the soil. Then instead of being deep in the soil, they've now surfaced and now are accessible to the livestock. And when it gets that dry, that's normally after we've had some rain. So the picture here, Robert, is we have some rains, and there's some water erosion from the rains, and the water will carry the spores, the bacteria, and concentrate them into some concentrated hotspot, so-called hotspot areas. So the spores are concentrated. That's damp, mud. The spores are not normally available until it gets dry. So we'll have some rains in the late winter, early spring, enough to make these concentrated areas. Then in the summer, it gets so hot and dry, the spores surface, and then the livestock find those concentrated areas and ingest the spores either by grazing the grass that's there, because it surfaced onto the grass, or maybe it got further up onto some browsing vegetation where deer would actually browse. So the exposure occurs. And then later in the summer, excuse me, like now, when we get on into October and November, we pick up some more rains, and now those dry areas will erode, and we make some additional hot spots. So the recent case last week in the Tom Green County, or west central Texas, which is not really a common place, but we do have it periodically, probably followed some of these fall rains, created some additional hot spots, and there was 5 cattle and 1 calf, 5 grown cows and 1 calf that got exposed. So relate to this, it's really the environmental conditions that sets up the risk of exposure.
Okay. And I think when most people in America think of anthrax, they think of 9/11 and bioterrorism. However, anthrax is primarily a pathogen of livestock and wild animals, as you pointed out. Mm-hmm. How does anthrax present in an animal?
Okay, it is really a livestock disease, and the species of livestock that's most susceptible to anthrax would be the cattle, sheep, and goats, the herbivores, those that are eating the grass. Not only are they likely to get more exposed because eating contaminated grass, but their bodies are just more susceptible to the invasion and the development of the disease compared to other livestock like horses and swine. But there are cases of horses and swine, but the disease is not as severe compared to in the cattle, sheep, and goats, and then also in the deer. Of course, it gets into any warm-blooded animals. Even the dogs and cats could get infected, but they're not as susceptible, so the disease would be more mild in the dogs and cats. People are not as susceptible to anthrax as the cattle, sheep, and goats, so the disease is normally milder in the people that are being exposed in these contaminated areas, mainly handling some dead carcasses. But in the cattle, sheep, and goats, and I'll pinpoint primarily the cattle, it is a devastating disease in cattle. They die quickly. The disease develops very quick after exposure, maybe just 2 or 3 days within a week. There are clinical symptoms, and this is all related to like blood poisoning, because once the spores are ingested, they come out of the spores into a vegetative stage and start multiplying very rapidly, and their waste products creates a toxin, a poison, so they end up with blood poisoning. And the symptoms would be stumbling and staggering and wobbling around like a neurological disease. And then they just go down and can't get up. And if it's a real hot case, they're going to just die standing up. So the most common symptom as this disease develops in cattle, they die suddenly. They really die standing up. So when they hit the ground, they're already dead. If exposure is a little bit lighter, they may live a day or so before they die, but normally it is a sudden death. And so the symptoms may not even be observed other than just finding dead cattle. Same way with sheep and goats. The deer, normally just find dead deer. But in the horses and the swine, there may be more of a gastrointestinal type disease. They linger on, several days and show some signs of sickness, and then sometimes even recover. So it is a blood poisoning systemic type disease that will kill these herbivore livestock that we see periodically here in Texas.
Okay, and when there is a case like this, what is the typical procedure that agricultural authorities or animal health authorities do to after an animal is discovered? Okay.
It is a reportable disease in each state, meaning that it's by law, by regulation, animal health regulation, it is to be reported to the state authorities, the animal health authorities, an animal health regulatory agency such as the Texas Animal Health Commission. Once that report is received by the regulatory agency, and that report normally is received by the veterinarian involved or the diagnostic lab. So if a veterinarian collects a blood sample from a dead animal and sends it to the lab diagnoses anthrax. By regulation, they're to report it immediately to the Animal Health Regulatory Agency, and then they activate their control program plan, which would be go to the premises and quarantine the premises. So that one farm ranch is now under quarantine. No cattle can leave out, no livestock can leave out, no livestock can come in. It is quarantined. And then the carcasses, the dead animals, whether they're cattle, sheep, goats, or maybe possibly the deer that are discovered, by regulation they are to be burned. That's the only effective way to destroy the anthrax spores is by burning. So the carcasses are to be burned. And then a requirement or regulation is for the livestock to be vaccinated against anthrax. So there's an anthrax vaccine that's available. So the veterinarian or the livestock producer vaccinates the live animals, and then the quarantine is released 10 days after the last animal is vaccinated or the last animal has died. So it's a fairly short quarantine. So they're quarantined, they get their animals vaccinated, they burn the carcasses, and then 10 days later the quarantine is released. So that's the procedure for the regulatory agency. It is reportable. So when a farmer or rancher finds a dead deer and suspects anthrax, or finds a dead cow, suspects anthrax, ought to contact their veterinarian. The veterinarian would go out and collect a blood sample. They don't do a necropsy, don't open up the animal, because those vegetative bacteria would form spores and contaminate the environment. So the veterinarian would just draw blood and with a syringe and needle and send in the blood sample. Or they could even call the state regulatory agency, and they would come out to take the sample.
Okay. And with this most recent case in the cow and the earlier cases with the sable antelopes, was there any risk of human exposure with those cases?
No, there hasn't been, other than something that might be very, very low risk. The bacteria is in the environment. The bacteria is in the dead animal. So when an antelope is discovered that's dead, or a deer or cattle, if they haven't handled that carcass, if they hadn't opened it up or drug it around and got some body fluids, because once the animal dies from this stumbling and staggering and wobbling and drops dead, they normally decompose very rapidly. They'll bloat, because these are gas-forming bacteria. They'll really produce a lot of gaseous decomposition. Normally non-clotting blood will be oozing out the mouth and out the nose and out the anus. Now, if they don't handle any of that, which the recent cases they haven't, they backed off and didn't have any exposure to that carcass, so there's no risk of exposure, to the people. But those that, out of ignorance, start handling that animal, lifting it, moving it, and get those discharges on them, where there's opening up the carcass or the body openings that have a discharge, then they have an exposure to the bacteria, and the exposure would normally be cutaneous on the skin, so their hands are, contaminated, their arms, their face, and the bacteria can enter the skin if there's a cut or some kind of abrasion, and causes then a local black necrotizing type lesion. So it's a cutaneous disease. There's not the risk of inhalation. The bacteria is not in the air. It's not an aerosol transmission. It's really by contact. So it's normally if a person ends up with the anthrax because they handled the carcass, or maybe they found a dead deer in the wild, and it was decomposed, and they decided to pick up some bones or pick up the antlers and take them home, and they get hand contamination, skin contamination. If they've got an abrasion or cut, they normally end up with an infected lesion. They're not really inhaling it to get a lung infection. Now, if they happen to get their hands in their mouth and swallow the bacteria, they could get a gastroenteritis and be an infection, in the stomach or the intestine. But it's normally just a localized black-type lesion infection that responds very well to antibiotics under the treatment of a physician. So the risk of exposure to people is not that great when in an area that has periodic cases of anthrax, because they're not handling the carcasses, unless, again, by mistake, they pick up some antlers or move a dead cow. They live in that area. This is on their place. The only place the anthrax is surviving are in these little hot spots scattered around. And these are real sticky bacteria. They're heavy. They're not in the air. They're down in the soil. They're not drifting around in the air. So the risk would have to be eating the vegetation or eating the dirt. I say, well, you could have a picnic on a blanket and no exposure to anthrax as long as you're not eating the dirt. So it's not a transmission to people. And you brought up the point about the fear of bioterrorism. That's very true, because this is a bioterrorist pathogen. This is on the list for bioterrorists to use to infect livestock as well as people. But they would develop that in a laboratory, in a culture, and it would dry it out in a real dry powder, and make an aerosol product out of it, so they could fly with an airplane or go in with an aerosol spray in the airport or a football game or where there's a lot of people congregated, and that would be aerosol. So if that lab culture would be inhaled, then you could have the deadly lung infection and the deadly gastroenteritis. But in the livestock areas of states that have periodic cases, we're just not seeing human cases just because of the no or low exposure to the spores.
Okay, great. Now, Buddy, I want to go ahead and close this interview with talking about vaccinations. In a Texas A&M news release last week, I read a quote by you about recommending vaccinating livestock against anthrax. Can you talk more about the vaccine for animals?
Okay. The vaccine for animals is produced only for livestock, not for people. It is produced by Colorado Serum Company, and it's available over the counter for livestock producers to purchase. It's available, of course, to the veterinarians. It is a live spore vaccine, but it's been attenuated. It doesn't produce a disease because it is so modified and attenuated. It's a non-pathogenic strain of anthrax that has a real high level of antigenicity, which means that it works very well as an antigen to stimulate very good immunity, taking only one injection normally every year. So the vaccine is a live vaccine that's recommended to be used prior to the risk of exposure. Knowing the risk of exposure is following some rains when it gets real dry in the summer. So late winter, early spring, it's recommended for the producers to vaccinate their livestock, and they can be cattle, sheep, goats, and horses. And that protects them for that summer. After several months, the level of immunity starts dropping, so a booster is required every year. So it's an annual booster, which would be occurring kind of in the springtime. We have this break, a few cases in Tom Green County. They did vaccinate that entire herd. They moved them to another area and kept them there for the vaccination for this 10-day period to go. But normally it's not recommended to vaccinate in the fall unless there's a break. And if it's not a break, it's just a routine vaccination in the spring. But that would only be for those producers in an area of Texas that periodically sees anthrax in their livestock. This is not a statewide vaccination. It's just in those areas like Tom Green County. It's also the major area would be in South Texas, kind of a triangle down south of San Antonio, going out to Uvalde, Ozona, down toward the Rio Grande River, or the Rio Grande area, and that's where we have periodic cases. So those producers do use annual vaccinations.
Well, fantastic. This has been very informative. Okay. I've been talking to Dr. Buddy Faries he's a professor and veterinarian with Texas A&M University. Thanks, Buddy, for spending the time with me today.
All right, well, appreciate it. Thank you, sir. All right, thank you.
You bet.
Bye.